Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Paulo Brito and I'm a composer and performer of new classical music. On this channel, I share some of my work as well as my passion for bringing contemporary music to a wider audience. Today, I'm very lucky to have with me the wonderful soprano Morgan Reid, who will actually introduce today's piece together with me. And she's, of course, also the featured performer in this piece. Before we get to today's piece, I just want to take a quick moment to introduce Morgan. Morgan has sung major roles in 20th century operas like Benjamin Britten's Midsummer Night's Dream, with the Halifax Summer Opera, as well as Britten's Gloriana and André Previn's Streetcar Named Desire with Canada's National Opera Institute. Morgan is currently pursuing a doctorate in vocal performance at the University of Toronto. At the same time, she's also developing her experience as a vocal teacher. And thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Since I'm lucky to have Morgan here with me today, I thought that together we might take a bit of a different approach to introducing this piece, namely by talking about our process of preparing and working on this music and on this kind of music in general, which we think might be of interest to composers and performers who are also dealing with this kind of contemporary vocal music. We hope you find that interesting. And before we actually get into our discussion, I just want to say that, as always, I have the timestamps below if you want to skip ahead to the piece. But even if you do, please remember to like and subscribe and let us know in the comments what you think. Also, that's very important to us. So today's piece is a set of songs using the poetry of Arthur Rimbaud, who is a very well-known French late 19th century symbolist poet. And if you want to know more about the piece specifically, I do have the program notes below, but today we're going to focus more on some practical questions of approaching and of preparing and performing this kind of music. This piece I wrote actually in 2016-17, and then I had it sort of in my my briefcase for a while until I met Morgan, basically, and we performed it together last year, and then we recorded it, and I actually have the recording for you today, so I'll put you'll have the score to follow along with the recording. So Morgan, why don't we start off by talking about some of the kinds of challenges or the particular kinds of issues that one encounters when approaching this kind of music as a vocal performer?
Absolutely. I think pedagogically, one of the things that seems daunting to singers, especially when it comes to new music, is this overwhelming feeling of, oh, well, I don't know how to do that. They think it's this completely nebulous, extreme thing. And that's something I've actually often heard from colleagues that are especially tentative when it comes to leaping into new music. But recently, it's been expected of singers to dive into this modern repertoire and have the versatility to approach these things that are more outside of the box, I guess. And we're seeing that even crop up as a requirement for recitals at institutions, requirement on audition packages, what have you. That being said, there are definitely some different challenges when it comes to approaching this sort of repertoire. I mean, it would be easy if there was kind of one cookie cutter way to learn it. But as for any piece, really, it kind of depends on what kind of learner you are. So for me, I like listening to things over and over so I can become familiar with the direction of the melody to see how certain notes fit together sonically. And this could be listening to recordings, it could be listening to my collaborator play a certain part over and over, or even listening to a track. But it really comes down to muscle memory in a way. I'm a very kinesthetic learner, so it's repetition in listening, but then also repetition in action to really get it in my body and in my voice. So in many ways, breaking it down, it's not all that much different than learning traditional repertoire, I guess, too.
Actually, when you talk about being a kinesthetic learner, that's really something that I can relate to as a pianist, actually, because that's really how I would say how I learn my repertoire, whether it's, Liszt or whether it's my own music too. It's basically by playing it. In some ways, I feel that it's a much less intellectual process than composing or conducting, where you really are going from a kind of an abstract vision of a piece. I would say that, as a performer of on stage where you're singing or playing, you really are getting it into your fingers in my case. And I think that for you, it's the same thing of getting it into your voice. And by practicing, and as you do that, basically you learn it, whatever it is. I don't think that it's as sort of dependent on the specific style or difficulty as much as people might think. Because I find that the process is almost identical, even as far as memorization goes to some extent, right? In fact, I would say that whatever the style is, that those things that require more practice are easier to memorize for that same reason than the things that actually require less practice, but then, you actually really have to think about it. And that's hard to do on stage under pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find the more I know something and the more it's in my body, the less I have those moments of like, oh, where am I when I'm on stage? Because you just stop thinking about it. You just throw yourself into it. And I mean, in terms of learning the music, and this is something that comes up for singers a lot, if it's something you've never done before or you don't know how that's supposed to feel or how you're supposed to make that sound or what have you, especially with extended techniques, you can always talk to the composer if it's someone you're collaborating with, if it's someone who's still living, or even look to academic texts that might describe what the goal is. But take it to your collaborator or your coach or your teacher and kind of discuss the intention for the sound. And you can always find ways to evoke that quality within your own voice or in your own body. That being said, it's not always perfect. I find for me personally, sometimes my brain almost tricks me into thinking, oh, well, that's how that's supposed to go, or oh, this actually goes this way, when it's not entirely correct. So sometimes I miss sing or I get a pitch wrong just because it's how I might have a preconceived idea of how it's supposed to go. But once we start working with other instruments, I also find it easy to stray from the path, especially in atonal music or new music, when you start to hear those new lines kind of weaving in with yours. Um, Sometimes it mixes the singer up just a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's why having this notion of how performers learn music, and how they work on the music is important for composers, because it's part of how it can help a composer to know or to think of ways to write something that's learnable. And I think that if it's the extent to which it's learnable also influences the extent to which it's performable as written. Because this is always, especially in contemporary music, a little bit of an issue is sort of how something looks on the page versus how it ends up being performed. And even with some works that are very well known and that have a lot of recordings, you can sometimes see that there's a bit of an issue with that. And I'm talking about myself just as much, right? Because I think this is something that I've started to pay attention to with experience. It takes experience as a composer to know that. So even for composers who aren't performers, it's important to get that feedback from the performer of sort of how they approach the music. And even though it's going to be different, obviously, for everyone, but there are general ways that are very similar and that they work. For instance, I'm talking about myself, but I could be talking about different pianists. For instance, I think you could be talking about any number of singers who work more or less in the same way. So I think that that's very important in helping the composer to get a grasp of, how do I write what I want to write, but also make it so that it will sound the way I want it to sound, so that it's clear to the performer and also possible for them. And I think that this is something that can be illustrated with a very banal kind of example, which is basically because it's something that I, for instance, had to learn to do as a composer, which is, when you're writing for a singer, you have to give them their entrance pitch. And this is something that it's very obvious and a lot of people know it, but it's not all, then you think, well, but then how do I do that so that in a way that makes sense within the piece? As a composer, you have a different set of priorities, right? So I'm still working on finding a way to make that work with my own music and sort of my own style and the way that I want to write it. But I do think that it's essential because, again, when I think of it from a performer perspective, I really am, when I see that the composer has thought about the performance and how something is going to be learned and how it's going to be performed. Because, performance is really kind of when you go on autopilot. It really is everything that you've already done, just do it in that moment, right? So these are not different. Sort of how I perform something and how I sort of practice something should not be all that different. It's the same thing for, I think that most musicians would agree with also. Now, speaking of that, also one thing that, and gaining experience as a composer, one thing that I wanted to ask you about, Morgan, because this is something that I've been thinking about more recently, is not just sort of beyond the basic well, I'm giving the entrance pitches so the singer knows where to enter. And once they enter, because I think that you would agree that this is once you know where to start and you've learned your part, you don't really think about it so much. You will sing where you need to go as long as you know where to enter. Like it's if you dropped out and you have to enter back, come back in, it's hard to know that pitch. And that's what we're talking about. It's just getting that one pitch and then you go. But I found that I'm more worrying or sort of interested or curious, let's say now, about this whole notion of tuning. So that, like, let's say you're on, like, okay, you entered and you're going and you know what you need to sing, but you're also like, you're listening to, as far as like the accuracy of the pitches, like the extent to which you're in tune. And of course, with tonal music, this is perhaps easier, quote unquote, because there's usually there are just fewer notes in the harmony, so there's always something to tune to, and there's and the textures are kind of designed to help you do that. With sort of more contemporary style, it's a bit harder, but I do think it's something that we should think about and pay attention to, because I find that I can tell, and there's a noticeable difference when the singer is able to tune to something in the music. And I was wondering if that's something that you pay attention to, and if you have any idea of sort of what works versus what doesn't, like let's say doubling a part for the singer or something like that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what you said earlier about how there are differences and maybe things that are quote unquote easier in certain textures. But I think that's also a challenge and also something that's quite beautiful in new music is that there's not one style that is currently happening within our era, if you would say. There's not one essential rule that anyone has to follow or one stylistic idea. So you may come across something that seems more, let's say, traditionally tuneful, just as often as you might come across something that's atonal. So, for instance, the scenes that I did with the National Opera Institute last summer were all 20th and 21st century works, but that ranged from Britten, which isn't extremely radical in any sense, especially in terms of tunes and tuning and pitches, and then Adams, which is quite minimalist, to Previn, which kind of has this lush, jazzy feel to it. And then everything else in between, I mean, nothing on the program really sounded alike, but that was also a challenge in the way that when you were stepping on stage to do that scene, you needed to readjust. You needed to kind of rethink where you were centered within that music, how that line fits. And that both works for accuracy of pitch and also tuning as well. And then in terms of doubling, in my opinion, it sometimes seems like a sort of musical relief, particularly to a singer. We have a moment to kind of turn our ears and our brains off for a second. And it's also a really great checking in point collaboratively for pitches, tuning, all of those things. And it doesn't necessarily have to be full mirroring. Like, I don't need to hear my entire part in another line, but even a single pitch or a couple pitches here and there can be a really good anchor, so you know where you are in terms of tuning, in terms of collaboration. And I remember actually we did a little bit of that work together while putting these pieces together, kind of finding patterns that I could pull from and finding notes that I could really focus on within both of our lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also part of what makes a difference is the just the number of instruments on stage in some ways, right? Like I've had this experience working with an ensemble, and especially often the piano's at the back. When I'm trying to listen for things like, let's say, like a cue or something like that, it can be hard, even in my own music, like where I know. Whereas and I think I can imagine for a singer, that's also an issue, and that's what I always worry about. Is like, well, if I write something in and I want it to be heard because it's going to give something to tune to or to listen for, will that actually happen? And that's always a bit of that's also requires a lot of experience, I would say, in some ways. But again, this particular piece, which is for voice and piano, when you really just have the two on stage, that's not an issue. I think that pretty much everything is audible, I would say. So with that, I would suggest that we now turn to the piece, and then Morgan and I will join you again after for some final comments.
quelque jour pour naissance les tantes. Oh, recousse les deux mouches éclatantes qui palpitantes des plantes cruelles. Golfe d'ombre. Et quand tu vas pas des glaciers fiers ou blancs, frissonnent ma belle. Hypoprès, sans crachet, rire des lèvres belles, dans la colère les viseresses pénitentes. Si clair, vibramenti fanteme viride, pedi pati semi d'animo, pedi ride che lasci mio primo grand France de Dieu. Je m'en allais les poings dans mes poches crevées, mon paletot aussi devenait idéal. J'allais sous le ciel, mais j'étais ton féal. Oh, que dans mon splendide j'ai rêvé. Petit pousset, rêveur, je remets à ma course des rimes. Mon abeille, j'étais à la grande ours. Mes étoiles, les au ciel, avaient un frou, frou. Septembre où je sentais des gouttes de rosée à mon front. Comme un vent de vigueur. Oh, Rimbaud, au milieu des ombres fantastiques, comme un pleurer rose au quête, consolant, non finir les blancs,
So that's it. We hope you enjoyed it, obviously. And even if that's not the case, please let us know in the comments. We really do want to hear from you and hear your impressions always, especially from people who may be new to contemporary music. That's really kind of the point, part of what we're trying to do here. So just to close out, maybe I thought we could talk about, actually take it a little bit away from just contemporary music and talk about some things that are, let's say, are in my piece that we just heard, but which relate generally to kinds of things, challenges, difficulties that singers and performers encounter. And I don't know if you had any thoughts about that. Maybe you could share them with us.
Yeah, I mean, for this piece in particular, the tessitura is pretty high, but this kind of gives singers a new challenge and a way to maybe tackle higher sitting repertoire that is fresh and new and contemporary. And when it comes to art song, I know a lot of coloratura sopranos seek out repertoire that specifically highlights that top end of their voice, this extension. That it's not always featured in a lot of art song repertoire or chamber repertoire, and especially when looking at works earlier in the canon, that sort of repertoire is often specialized, or maybe the composer even wrote it for a specific singer that they knew. And works for that type of voice are often found in opera more so than art song. There are a few famous examples. What comes to mind right away is maybe Strauss's Brentano Lieder. There are a few Debussy pieces that sit quite high. There's a set by Millot. But these are a few that come to mind for just art song repertoire. And these are often kind of the go-tos and are done a lot and performed a lot, because if you're looking to kind of accentuate that high end, that extension of your voice, there aren't a lot of art songs that always skew that high. So nowadays, though, composers of new music are sort of pushing these boundaries and are using kind of the extremities of the voice. And I think this gives singers with this sort of range the ability to explore more roles and songs too. And I mean, I think of some new operatic repertoire from recent years that have kind of made a splash and featured soprano parts that were extremely high, like Addis's Exterminating Angel, which broke the record at the Met for the highest note ever sung on the stage there. But I mean, opera singers are always marveled at for these techniques and this almost inhuman ability to sing these high notes. So using these extended techniques and benefiting from particular ranges sort of pushes that even further.
Well, and it's interesting to me that you think of range, and particularly like the high range, in talking about these songs. Actually, as far as my music is concerned, I would say my music for voice, and particularly for female voice, they're not really at the high end of that extreme. Actually, so I've worked with some other singers, in particular coloratura, kind of high sopranos. Actually have some of those performances on YouTube. If you want to check them out, I will put a link down in the description box below. So but when you talk about register extremes, that I think relates definitely to kind of to my work. And actually I can think of some pieces where I've worked with a singer whom I knew, And basically we kind of came up with some sort of registral limits that we wanted to push kind of together. And I basically did that in the music. And of course, when you're doing that, whether it's high or low, as a composer, you really have to find a way to make that fit into your overall writing and kind of into the structure of the piece. You don't want it just to be sort of something kind of random that pops out. So that's actually the challenge for me as a composer. But on the other hand, you also have a lot of possibilities, particularly I think when we're talking about the female voice, you know, and the sort of, there's the high notes, you know, but then there's also the low register. Now, what's interesting about these songs is I don't think about them as particularly high, partly because they actually go high and low, right, as you know. And I had explored a lot of the low register in these notes, and this is something that Morgan, if you hear her performance, she really sort of shows you how much there is in that low register too. I think that in general that's something today that's very easily kind of forgotten, and composers might not really know about, you know, particularly if they listen to a lot of recent kind of recordings. But the other thing is, and this is kind of what I was trying to, is that this is something that we also see in traditional music. I mean, there are a lot of things, you know, like whether we're talking about Strauss, for instance, the Brentano leader, we could be talking about Verdi also. There's a lot of sort of exploitation, shall we say, of you know, registral extremes. Now, that's when we're talking just about range. Of course, as you said, the tessitura, which is sort of the median range, sort of where most of the piece lies. I'm also intrigued that you find it high in this piece. I didn't try and do that. So that's something that I should keep in mind, that like, well, I'm doing it high, you know, if I don't know that, and perhaps, because it can get tiring, it's actually, right, it's easier to project it there, but it gets tiring, right, just to stay up there.
Yeah, I mean, it also just really depends on the voice too. And I might say this is partially personal, but I found that new music has really kind of helped me in the process and of developing my voice and the progress I've made over the last few years too. I mean, we recorded this sort of at the end of my first year of my master's degree, and you know, it's been a whole year since then. But new music has really allowed me to discover different parts of my voice in an unrestrained way. And by unrestrained, I mean I don't feel like I have any sort of restriction or expectation on me, or even a comparison. Like, I'm not going to be listening to recordings, like really famous recordings of these pieces that I'm working on that are brand new. They're kind of mine to make. And in the process of learning and putting these together, I therefore don't have any preconceived idea of what I'm supposed to sound like. So I'm not modifying my voice to fit something that I think it should be. I'm just singing. And yeah, my voice has changed a ton since we did these. So also too, looking back, as my voice has grown over time, something that might have been higher when I was younger or felt higher when I was younger might not necessarily be the case now, or vice versa. So there's all kinds of things to factor in when you're talking about singers. Some people love to just sit up in this high extreme part of the register, and some folks find it tiring. It just really depends on the singer, but it's always something to consider, and especially in terms of style and kind of what you want to evoke. And I think you're right. Sometimes they just think, oh, soprano, and they make us go as high as we possibly can, but to kind of forget about the beauty of the low range too, and kind of what timbres those can evoke as well.
So then I guess the moral of the story is to work on contemporary music when you're young and sort of really sort of get into it, not be afraid of it, and to think this may be something that, you know, you may be judged for doing, because actually the opposite is just as true, that some of that judgment is kind of suspended because it's a new piece. It's something that people don't have as many expectations built up around, and it allows you to develop yourself to some extent, and your own kind of identity, and possibly even your kind of vocal identity as well. I would say actually conversely for composers, what's important is knowing the repertoire, is knowing the tradition. And that's why I kind of wanted to bring it to this kind of more general topic of discussion, because I do think that, you know, that's how you learn. It's not just sort of looking things up in a book somewhere. I think that that's important if you're looking for some specific piece of information. I do think that if you want to know, and particularly something like the voice, which is so varied and diverse, and every voice sounds different, right? It's, you know, you really need to know what singers do, and you do that by hearing. So I would say it's almost, you know, singers need to do more new music, and composers maybe listen to a lot of old recordings of singers, and you'll be very surprised, I think, you know, and also sometimes some of the repertoire that people used to do also that we don't do, you know, some of like early 20th century things. There's a lot that's there. So I would say that that's a kind of a go-to area for composers and for singers. Obviously, I think new music definitely is. So I think that we basically covered what we've covered. Thank you again, Morgan, so much for joining me today. This was a lovely conversation and very interesting for me. So I hope also for our viewers. Thank you for everyone who watched. I will see you again next time. And hopefully maybe we can also convince Morgan to come and join us another time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.